I'd very much like to write a book on Art Nouveau Jugendstil in the Baltic, which would be to look in fact at Art Nouveau Jugendstil. They tend to call it Jugendstil in the north, in Stockholm, Malmo, Gothenburg. Anyway, that's my long-term project, to try and write a book about what's going on in all of the Baltic countries, making comparisons. You'll see what I mean, because Riga will be very much inspired by what's going on in Finland. So they call them Mascarones, these face masks, is on one of the more prominent buildings in Riga, as you'll see, and is your sort of classic symbolist Art Nouveau woman. She's got her eyes shut, but there's like a little gnome or elf in the stars above her head, or is it the man in the moon? I'm never 100% certain. None of these buildings come with notes from the architect explaining exactly what their symbolism was intended to convey. But you're looking here in the old town in Riga on the right-hand side, one of the most distinctive buildings by Constantine Plešins. Yes, you can correct my Latvian later. And it also belies the idea that all of the Art Nouveau Jugendstil is in the new town. There's actually quite a bit in the old town of Riga. So first of all, I just want to introduce you to where you are. Latvia feels oppressed in turn by the Germans, the Swedes, and finally the Russians. So here we are. You may have forgotten the proximity of Estonia to St. Petersburg. Tallinn, of course, capital of Estonia, then Riga, which is on a delta. And so the cruise ships don't go into Riga. It's on a estuarine delta, so it hasn't got a deep water harbour like Tallinn has. So the bigger cruise ships rarely go there. And then finally, obviously, Vilnius, which doesn't come into our equation at all. But a lot of people do these three Baltic capitals together. Vilnius, Riga and Tallinn are often overland. We tend to forget that there's a bit of Russia. That's still there, by the way. That's Kaliningrad. And this is why I always get very nervous about Putin. And he would like his Baltic states back now, please, because he would like an overland route to the bit of Russia they still have. And they were determined to keep Kaliningrad because they need a port on the Baltic, because until global warming, St. Petersburg was usually always iced in. That's the rather beautiful spire of St. Peter's, one of the most prominent landmarks in the old town of Riga. And I've taken you to the top of it for good reason. So this is the view from the top. Don't worry, you don't have to walk, there's a lift. But in the far distance, you can see the radio tower, which was at the center of the breakdown of the Soviet Union. The students captured that and began to broadcast their freedom messages. So that was one of the epicenters when officially all three Baltic states become independent in 1991. The famous demonstration where 2 million Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians, 2 million of them, joined hands and sang for their freedom. That was in 1989. It's surprising how few people know about that here in the West. Looking down from the top of St. Peter's, you can see one of the Russian buildings. It looks like a skyscraper. It's a bit like the top of the Empire State Building. But I want you to notice those rather strange, I'm going to show you with my pointer, these rather strange buildings here, because you might think that's a train station or a marketplace. Well, it is a market now, but they are actually Zeppelin hangars. And it's to remind you that when we are dealing with these cities that suddenly become prominent at the end of the 19th century, that much of it is to do with industry, with a rapid accumulation of money. We've got a lot of entrepreneurs making a lot of money and putting it back into their city. I'm thinking there are people like Burrell in particular, or Lord Leverhulme in England. So there was that idea that you made money and then you opened institutions or you made big collections. And where this is Russian Empire, if you remember, so that was part of the equation. And then also this idea of modernization, because Riga was one of the most, well, it was the most successful port on the Baltic. It dealt with more trade than any other, again, because it's part of the extended Russian Empire. And this is looking straight down, just to remind you that you do have this sort of two cities for the price of one. You have the old town of Riga, medieval layout, cobble streets, beautiful medieval merchants' houses, very different to the new town, which was developed once the walls came down, a bit like the ring around Vienna. The walls around Riga were demolished in the middle of the 19th century, which allows for this development into a new town that's essentially a grid formation, rather like Barcelona in that sense. And most tourists who might only visit Riga for a short period, well, they'll always head to Albertastrasse. It was Bishop Alberta who technically founded the city. So this street is named in his honor. Most of the buildings along it are by Michael Eisenstein, who trained in Russia. And his buildings are outrageous, but they're not necessarily indicative of Riga as a whole. And I will explain what I mean by that in a minute. Many of these buildings have undergone a restoration program in the last 10 years. I was last in Riga, confession now, in 2009. So I've got some good before and afters. You know, I've taken a lot of images of the Art Nouveau world server to compare to my images from 2009 to see how many buildings have in fact been done up. However, having said that, I'm afraid the restoration program has slowed dramatically since 2008 and the dreaded recession, and Latvia in general and Riga in particular really has suffered since the global collapse in 2008. So when you go to visit Riga, you're going to find they're rather confused about what they should call it. They call it Art Nouveau because this has become the lingua franca. Most people know, you know, even when they're in Barcelona, they refer to it as Art Nouveau, though technically we should be calling it Catalonian Modernista. And in any northern country, a Germanic country, and Latvia is very Germanic. I'll explain why in a minute. They call it Jugendstil, and that takes its title, or its name comes from the magazine Jugend, published in Munich from 1896. This is one of the first volumes. That's volume 2, as you can see. And the editor of it, George Herth, he actually came up with the term secession to differentiate those groups that actually broke away from an establishment, you know, like in Klimt in Vienna. They actually break with the academy, they secede or break away. And technically, therefore, if we're using it in the strictest term of breaking away, then the secessions are Munich, Vienna, and Berlin. But they, you know, it's become like Art Nouveau more broadly used, and we've seen that in Hungary, where there's also a degree of breaking away, they call it their secession. So I'm going to stick with the term Jugendstil because that, to my mind, fits this Riga zeitgeist better because of those German influences and origins. So this is to remind you of the complexities again of the history of the region. I am not going to go back to the Livonian Crusades, though we might do, because there's always been a lot of German intervention in the area because of the Hanseatic League. So this is a map showing you the extension of the Hanse League, which was about trade. The center of it was Lübeck. Riga was an imperial city, a very important Hanseatic League city. They traded particularly in skins and timber and salt and herrings. And it was like a sort of northern mafia, for want of a better word. So the Livonian Wars, as you can see, are late 16th century, and it was after the Livonian Wars, which are very complicated. Riga becomes a free imperial city until 1581. But there's the important thing here is that the Germans never give up their dominance in the region. There is a well-entrenched German aristocracy, even when it becomes part of the Russian Empire. So over the years, the Germans, the Swedes, and the Russians have all done their best, particularly to suppress the Latvian language. So the Gothic legacy is important, I think, and it's very much a German Gothic legacy. So when you go to visit as a tourist, you'll all go here. This is the rather beautiful headquarters or guild house of the Merchants Guild of the Blackheads. It's got nothing to do with acne. The Blackheads logo was St. Maurice, who we think was Nubian. So they have a term that we don't really like using now, but I'm going to use it because it's easier. They have a blackamoor as the logo for the Guild of the Blackheads. The rather ugly concrete building on the right-hand side is Russia. Now, the beautiful medieval building you're looking at here is actually brand new. It was totally destroyed in the Second World War, and I'll have some images right at the end, just to remind you again, like in Budapest, that we're lucky to have anything. Because Riga was very badly damaged at the end of the Second World War. Oh, here he is. I thought I'd better put in St. Maurice. So here he is holding his guild house, the guild head of the Brothers of the Blackheads, and you can see that he is perceived to be Nubian. Right, so here the Russians come to the fore. I love all these sweeping titles. The Great Northern War, which was between Russia and Sweden. Sweden had been a very dominant power in the north, but gradually, under people like Gustavus Adolphus, Gustavus Vasa, but gradually that power is eroded. Peter the Great, who by the way is called Peter the Great because he was 6'9", which is a giant by anybody's standards. He wanted a port on the Baltic, so he particularly wants Riga, which is taken in 1710. Most importantly, under the Treaty of Neustadt, the German aristocracy do not lose their powers. This is really important in understanding the schism in the 19th century, because it's the German entrepreneurs who are often making the money in Riga. And so you have a sort of tension between the German aristocracy and the gradually rising Latvian nation. So that's always something to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is Lutheranism, because it is so Germanic, unlike, say, somewhere like Vilnius, which is Lithuania, which is very Catholic. Riga is really a Lutheran city from the 16th century onwards. Tsar Alexander III, he's very keen to make them all Russian. And as soon as you start oppressing people, they tend to do the exact opposite. They start to say, hang on a minute, we would like to have our own language and our own culture. But alongside the rustification policies, you have a lot of prosperity. So most importantly, not just the port aspect, but a new railway system, which linked Latvia not only to Russia, but to other parts of Europe. And the city is able to expand once those walls are demolished. They're a bit like Franz Josef pulling down the walls around Vienna. And you can see here, it makes a very distinctive shape. So where the river runs, in fact, it's sort of like, this is the main river here. And hang on, it's the Degala, I think, is the main, I should know this, shouldn't I? It's the main river here. But this is sort of like a tributary of it. And it's running through this green space here. And that is essentially where the fortifications were. So there's the old town. There's the Brotherheads building, Blackhead Brothers building. And there's the Church of St. Peter, which is not the cathedral, but it's the one that we all really head to because of its rather magnificent spire. And on this side, you can see the grid pattern of the new town emerging. So old and new town. So in terms of education, well, many had to go to St. Petersburg, but in terms of our own architects, many of them are going to be trained locally, which will perhaps explain this desire to evolve a style that was on the one hand modern and on the other distinctly Latvian. So the first technical society, 1864, then the Polytechnium has an architectural department created, and that's in 1869. Many of them still go to St. Petersburg to train, but these local polytechnics and academies are outside the immediate control of St. Petersburg. So in other words, they have greater autonomy. If they don't train locally and they don't want to go to St. Petersburg, the other place they all head to is Berlin, because again, remember that strong Germanic element. So German Latvians, if they want to have a career as an architect, they are more likely to go to Berlin. 1872, we have a craft school founded, which I suppose is really a bit like the art schools founded in the UK, the national ones, you know, like the Royal College of Art will eventually evolve out of our national art schools, because these were much more rooted in training people for a vocation. So they weren't geared around becoming a fine artist. So that's the big difference again between the Royal Academy schools in London and if you went to the South Kensington art schools. They were much more grounded in a practical approach that would lead you to have a career as much in a trade, silver, ceramics, or whatever, the design world as we would now call it. They weren't geared towards you becoming a fine artist. The Kunstverehren, you see how all the most important institutions have German names. That's largely because it's German Latvians behind them. And this holds exhibitions and will gradually become more liberal. So they're going to show particularly works by the German symbolists, also people like Hodler, who's Swiss, but it's more far-reaching in its outlook. And then when the Riga Art Salon is opened, they start to show works by the Finns like Gall and Kalila, and even the Pre-Raphaelites, dare I say it. There are obviously very strong ties to Russia. So you might have heard of the World of Art group. That's its Russian name. I'll let you try to work that one out. But the World of Art group was again much more liberal. They had a magazine and they held regular exhibitions, and they were much more likely to showcase French Art Nouveau, French Impressionism and post-Impressionism. So again, it's this idea that the Academy appears to loosen its grip, or to even lose its grip, in favour of more progressive artistic institutions like the World of Art, which is a Russian group, and the Riga Art Salon. They all come along quite late, as you can see, 1898. Running alongside this liberalisation, a sort of international outlook where they are wanting to see paintings by the French, the Germans, and this interest in realism, naturalism, and symbolism. Alongside that, you've got this great growing desire to assert Latvian national independence. They want to revive their language, and alongside that, they want to create architectural and design styles that speak of the unique culture of Latvia. This is Ezien Laub, so he's going to be a very important architect who we see later, but this is the Riga Latvian Society. Very important in our story, because this is going to become the epicenter for collecting folk tales and folk songs. And Janice Rosenthal, one of their most important artists, provided the frescoes, which are actually a form of mosaic for the front of the building. So here's a close-up. So we have two Latvian awakenings. I rather like this idea. The first Latvian national awakening occurs, as you can see, in the 50s through to the 1880s. It then becomes more politicized, which is known as the New Current. That's because it's more overtly socialist. And that leads up to the first Russian Revolution of 1905, which was very important in Latvia, because it was after the first Russian Revolution of 1905 that the Latvians demanded greater autonomy. The murals are actually, as I say, a form of sgraffito and mosaic. This one remember they're by Janice Rosenthal, more of him later. This one is to represent beauty. Here's a close-up of it. It's at the top of the building. So you can see that it's it's like almost rough. I think it's plaster rather than cement, but hopefully you can see that around the figure of beauty, there's a mosaic halo. So they're an interesting media. Here's the one in the centre of the building, which represents
No, Pauline, it's Susan Brown.
power, which I'm hoping you can see again. There's some mosaic elements. If you look at his hammer here in particular, where it's like gold tessera have been pressed into the sort of plaster background. So this is to represent power. And I suppose the idea here is sort of Latvia asserting its unique character. And as we know from looking at this in Budapest, the very obvious way to assert your different character is to go back to your origins, to your mythic past. And that inevitably means folklore traditions. Now, interestingly enough, in Latvia, they had no major heroes. They didn't have the equivalent of the Finnish Kalevala. They didn't have a sort of Mort d'Arthur Arthurian tale that they could fall back on. But they were still able to assert difference through their mythology, which I'm afraid they also amplify. My apologies for a bit of text here, but it's quite complicated. So August, and again, please note he's a German, Bellenstein is the first one to sort of collect folklore and to form a material culture in that Latvian society building that we've just been looking at. And this reaches a peak, as you can see, in the late 1880s with publications. So this is no longer obscure. It's actually now entered the mainstream. But the most important figure is Christian's Barons, as he is the one who is going to collect the songs. More than anything, in Latvia, it is singing. This is like Estonia. It's really through the folk songs, more than the folk tales or the fairy tales, that the traditions of Latvia, or the Latvians, are kept alive. However, the mythology, they have a mythology that's not too dissimilar to the Vikings, in the sense that it's pantheistic. So you have a god of the moon, a god of the sun, god of the harvest. So one of their favorites was the sun goddess Sauli, and the moon goddess Menes. And you protect your building by putting a gargoyle on it. In this case, it's a pair of it's on the end of a roof line along the eave. It's a pair of crossed horses, believe it or not. And that was to ward off the devil, and its function was to supply a good harvest. And the god that you were invoking was Jumis. Okay, so if you've ever been to the Ethnographic Museum just outside Riga, you will recognize this, because that was where I photographed it. They felt rather bereft, however, that they didn't have a hero, so they thought they would make one up. Everybody's making up heroes at the end of the 19th century. The Kalevala, which is the Finnish one, does have its roots in an ancient mythic origin story, but the Estonian equivalent, the Kalevipoeg, is largely made up. And the national epic, composed by Pumpers, is again a sort of, I'm afraid, expanded. So he finds one or two folk tales, he expands the pantheon of Latvian gods, and most importantly, he creates a hero who is known as the Bear Slayer. The example of the Bear Slayer that you're looking at here is on the Riga Freedom Monument, which is right in the city centre, actually marks the division between the old and the new town. Latvia was only free for a very short period, immediately after the First World War, 1920, so when, of course, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is made in the mid-1930s, when Hitler and Stalin carve up the area between them, and they lose their independence again at that point with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. God, that's a mouthful. So singing, they are known as Daninas. There's millions of them, evidently. They are short songs, long songs, ballads, proverbs, and they're little, as it says here, little quatrains of wisdom. They date back thousands of years. They've been handed down father to son, mother to daughter in an oral tradition. And then Christian's Barons decides to collect as many as he can. We believe now, as scholarship is continuing, that there's over 1 million of these danas. Every Latvian is a born poet. They all compose verses and songs, and they can all sing these songs. They deserve to be called a nation of poets. You could say exactly the same about the Estonians. And I've been very lucky. I was actually at, year before last, the Estonian Song Festival, which takes place at midsummer. And Estonians return from all over the world to sing. And when they were trying to get their independence from the Soviet Union, that was how they did it. They sang at their resistance. So the first Latvian Song Festival is actually held in 1873. And my poster here from 1910 is by Janice Rosenthal's again. Please note the beautiful costume she is wearing. So here is Christian's Baron. So he's sort of like the father of this urge to collect, well, to collect the sort of ultimate selection of important folk songs. They're all kept here in this cabinet. He's an ethnographer. He goes around Latvia collecting these songs and writing them on little bits of paper. They're all in this amazing cabinet which has survived. Christian's Barons is commemorated too in an amazing song garden, which is near Sigulda. And I'm going to show you some of the sculptures from this sculpture park. And that's, by the way, said to be a representation of Christian Janice as a sort of old man. That's a photograph of him in the top. But he's like the grand old man who travels all over Latvia collecting these folk songs. The cabinet survives in the National Gallery. Oh, hang on, I need my picture. Here it is. So a song for him, a song for her, for a piece of bread is just the type of sort of homespun philosophy that you'll get in these folk songs. So this is the sculpture park commemorating Barons at Sigulda. It's really popular tourist attraction. All of the sculptures are by Aldolfus Perler. It was created during the Soviet era, believe it or not. Don't know quite how they got away with it, but it starts in the mid-1980s. But it was a private foundation, so that may be how they got around some of the problems. Okay, so on this side then, as I said, we've got Christian's Barons. So hang on, here he is. Here's his portrait. This is the other side of the same stone. And this is supposed to represent the different generations of women who learn the songs and pass them on from one generation to another. So this is supposed to be on the far side, an old woman, so a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter in the center, passing on these traditions. If you've ever been to visit, they'll make you sing, they'll make you dance. You just got to enter into it with alacrity. And there's an abstract element, obviously, to the sculptures. This is looking across, as you can see, 4 of them. I think that's the thinker in the background, but we'll see him in a minute. A lot of them are about the things that meant a lot to Latvians, like horses. We've already seen the horse guarding the roof line of the house in the Ethnographic Museum, just outside Riga. So here it is in praise of the horse. And one of the songs was, "My steed had a blanket of stars on its back." And then this is the love stone. I love that. And a lot of newlyweds come and sort of like make a little offering. And it's supposed to be a sort of reference to the daughters of the sun. And this is the thinker and the dreamer. And they make a sort of pair. And it's this idea, again, of dreaming about, in the mid-1980s, remember, dreaming about Latvian independence and asserting Latvian cultural differences. I rather like them. They have a sort of primitivism to them, with some Rodin thrown in for good measure. So that brings us to Janice Rosenthal, who's often seen to be Latvia's most important artist. It's a toss-up between Rosenthal's and Pluvitis. You'll meet him in a minute. There are three. They're all interlinked because they're all the same generation. Wolfe is the third in the triumvirate, and they're all interlinked because they all study together at the academy in St. Petersburg. So Wilhelm's Pluvitis is down the bottom if you want to get the spelling of his name. We have a photograph here of Rosenthal's, a self-portrait, but in the middle, please note his very influential wife. So in 1903, he marries Ellie Forsell, who is a Finnish. They will create their own salon with lots of intellectuals coming to visit them when they settle in Riga. And in the photograph at the bottom, please note that she is very much a new woman. Can you see she's wearing an Art Nouveau robe with a wonderful embroidery motif running along the bottom. When the war hits, they flee to Helsinki, and sadly he dies prematurely of a heart attack in 1916. Right, now being trained in St. Petersburg means that you're going to be influenced by progressive Russian art. So I am not going to attempt to say it in the Russian, but this is the group, the famous group known as the Wanderers or the Itinerants. They get that name because they organize a lot of traveling exhibitions. And again, they are forward-looking initially. See how early they are formed, 1863. And initially, all their influences come from French realism. Remember, Gustave Courbet has emerged in the mid-1850s as the leading French realist. Most importantly, the Wanderers rebel against the Academy. So they're not exactly a pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, but the analogy is, quite a good one. There's 14 of them altogether. And in 1870, growing out of it is this Society for Travelling Arts Exhibitions, which is how modern art is essentially disseminated around the Russian Empire. The most famous artists from our point of view, Shishkin, Repin, and I'm going to look at him by his first name, I think, Arkhip, hang on, Kundai. Oh no, I don't even think I can have a go at that one. I do apologize. I need Russian lessons as well, don't I? Please remember I'm dyslexic, so all of this is a struggle for me. But Repin and Shishkin are the ones I'm sure that you will have come across. Arkhip was very important for landscape, as you'll see in a minute. And this is the type of modern art that they were promoting. And the breakthrough, I know you're going to find this little bit contrary, but the breakthrough is the fact that he's painting Russia. Nobody thought to actually paint their homeland. So one of the big breakthroughs is very simply that these artists go abroad, they learn skills, they come back to their homeland, and then they set about actually capturing for the first time their native landscape. So the Rooks have returned, 1871. It becomes a really important painting because it's one of the very first to actually depict the Russian landscape. And they particularly like the idea of spring, sort of like the end of winter and the coming of a new start. Right, so this is Ivan Shishkin, and he's painting here with Konstantin Savitsky, who did the bears, okay? Shishkin did the background, Savitsky did the bears. They did a sort of split between them. But the important thing is that, again, this is a huge breakthrough to be again painting of the Russian landscape, and very clearly here the sort of emotive forests of the far north. This is, again I will do my best to pronounce it for you, is the State Tretyakov Palace gallery collection. So he was an entrepreneur in the late 19th century. This is Tretyakov, who put together the most amazing collection of contemporary Russian art. And when the Soviet Union comes to power, it's confiscated and becomes a state institution. But it still now bears the name of the founder. So this is like the Borel collection in Moscow, if you want to go in search of it. Okay, this is Ivan Shishkin on his own, and this is in the Russian State Museum in Moscow. He particularly wanted to paint snow. In the wild north is particularly emotive. So winter is the horizontal one, and in the wild north of 1891 reminds me immediately of Axel Gallen-Kallilar's desire to paint snow. He's the great Finnish painter at this time. So many of the wanderers simply gained a reputation for painting their own landscape. Repin was even more like Courbet. He was a rebel, and he wanted to capture the difficulty of eking out a living in Russia at the end of the 19th century. So Volga Boatman is one of his most famous paintings, again in the State Russian Museum in Moscow. So here, you know, it's the inhumane conditions. This reminds me, they look like they're still serfs. Serfdom, by the way, was outlawed in Latvia in the opening years of the 19th century. Serfdom was basically slavery. And he's a social realist. You can compare him again to Courbet, but also to some of the paintings by Jules Bastien Lepage, which date to the 1880s. This one, as you can see, however, is much earlier than that. It's from 1873. And I've mentioned the first Russian Revolution, which we tend to forget. This occurred in October the 17th, 1905. It was the first attempt to challenge the sort of inequalities of the Russian Empire. It was seen to inspire everybody from the upper classes, the intellectuals, through to the working classes. So here, this is Repin attempting to depict that cross-section of society, particularly in Latvia. So this is obviously supposed to be Moscow or St. Petersburg, I think, proclaiming that countries want greater autonomy, less corruption, and a greater say for the working classes in terms of the vote. So that's the first Russian Revolution. When Rosenthal returns to Latvia, having trained in St. Petersburg, he basically does become something of a Bastien Lepage, in that again he breaks through a barrier and wants to paint ordinary working class Latvians, peasants to all intents and purposes. He tried to settle in his hometown of Saldus, but that didn't really work out. I think, like many, his bread and butter would have been portraiture, and that would have been a very difficult practice to establish in the countryside, isolated. So he will return and spend most of his adult career in Riga. Two absolutely indicative paintings of this era, again, social realism, Art of the Church, which rather like Repin's here, which shows an entire cross-section of society from high to low. We have the same idea here. We have the German aristocracy, the middle class, but most importantly, the peasant class, as you can see, leaving church. Some wearing national costume, as you can see. And the same idea, 1895, from the cemetery. So again, at the time, this was seen to be a real breakthrough, because you're painting Latvians. Remember that most of your clients are going to be Baltic Germans. They are the ones that are forging ahead as entrepreneurs, making money, running factories. And so again, you can imagine that that Rosenthal is going to be struggling to sell Latvian subjects to Germanic aristocrats. In the 1890s, however, he seems to leave realism behind as he embraces European symbolism. So we've still got the peasant subject here, but death, or rather beautiful death with a scythe, has come to visit, and it's the baby, I'm afraid, who is going to become the victim. You can see it's painted in a rather Bastien Lepage style, very vertical in terms of the application of the brushwork. But what really I think changes Rosenthal's outlook is getting married to a woman who was equally as artistic and progressive as him. This is the wife is the famous opera singer. who is Finnish in terms of her origins. And you can see her here again, how advanced she is, and she's wearing a rather beautiful Art Nouveau robe. So he marries in 1903, they'll have 3 children, and here as a lithograph and as an oil painting, we have Ella. So the link to Finland is very important. He starts to visit Finland, and Finland already has a very strong symbolist school led by Axel Gallen-Kallela, who is very keen to depict scenes from the Kalevala. So remembering that he's just been painting Latvian peasants, we are now painting Maiden and Nature's Spirit and Woman and Poppies. And we're looking at dates around, 1908, 1910. They are rather charming little monsters, aren't they, in the water? And there's a devil looking over her shoulder. Now, Finland was ahead of Latvia in terms of asserting its cultural difference. It is going to have one of the most important pavilions at Paris 1900. It is created by this famous Finnish triumvirate, Galinius, Armas Lindgren, and Eliel Saarinen, all names that might be familiar to you, as they all go on to become really important exponents of Jugendstil into modernism. Saarinen is the author of the famous railway station in Helsinki. So this is the pavilion for Paris 1900. I particularly want you to notice the unusual form of the arch as you entered the building, because it's a very distinctively Finnish. They sort of flatten the arch. They sometimes cut the top off as well. You'll see what I mean in a minute. And these are all things that we can certainly look for in the architecture of National Romanticism in Latvia. So this style, hang on, I'll go back to it very briefly. This style is known as National Romanticism as much as it's known as Jugendstil or Secession. Inside, in the center of the pavilion, you had a series of murals by Gallen-Kallela, most importantly on the theme of the Kalevala, this immense saga that involves magical swords and all sorts of quests. And this has been reconstructed. In fact, it was painted by Gallen-Kallela, but the themes were reconstructed in the National Museum in Helsinki. Ploughing the Viper field is supposed to be nationalistic, because the Vipers are supposed to be Russia, because again, Finland wants to assert its cultural difference. And forging the Sampo, well, the Sampo is a magical sword that's going on the right-hand side, and the Sampo will be used, that's the sword, will be used, it's a bit like the sword in the stone story, that's why I said you could relate the Kalevala to Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It's like Excalibur. The Sampo will be really important for killing the giant dragon. You need a PhD just to understand all of the mythological tales that circulate around the Baltic at the end of the 19th century. So here is, again, this schizophrenia. So this is Janice Rosenthal's Temptation. I love the story of Lilith. I'm sure that you will not necessarily familiar with it, as it's from the Apocrypha. It's not officially in the Bible, but sort of a part that was expunged. And this is supposed to be the sort of tension between Lilith, who is the snake who lives in the tree of knowledge, who will tempt Eve and lead to man's downfall. So you can see here Lilith has got bright red hair. She is Adam's first wife, remember, born out of the slime, and as a form of punishment from God, is transformed into the serpent. As you can see in both images, Eve is looking a little, well, a little worried. It's likely to have been inspired by this, Franz von Stuck's famous Sin, painted 10 years earlier, 1893, with again, this is supposed to be Lilith. So Lilith is transformed, remember, into the serpent that lives in the tree of knowledge. So it is this idea that women are a schizophrenic dichotomy. We can either be very, very good, or we can be very, very bad. And the decadence, I'm afraid, of the 1890s tends to favour the very, very bad. This painting was notorious. In case of Janice Rosenthal, his most famous painting is this, again, not easy to interpret image known as the Princess and the Monkey. This is so famous in Latvia that many have it as a print on their wall, and it was even turned into a stamp. I have no idea exactly what the story is. It's supposed to be a parable or an allegory. It's based, the model for it was a very well-known contemporary gymnast. Though many have searched for other models in terms of she might be a famous film star, but we do believe that it's a well-known gymnast that he saw at a fancy dress party, you know, dressed up to look like a Roman, and this inspired this sort of decadent image of a woman playing with her monkey. So it could have two meanings. Either it's this idea that art apes nature, or the other is that women simply toy with men. We are, you know, men are just the plaything of the femme fatale. I'll leave you to decide which you fancy, but it's certainly Rosenthal's most famous painting. And other obvious symbolist works that he produced here for the Riga Latvian Theatre, which was one of the first institutions to have plays performed not only in Latvian, but by Latvian playwrights. Okay, so it's this idea of really asserting your cultural difference through your language. And again, the idea here is a sort of pantheon here of Latvian gods and goddesses. They didn't like devils. They were particularly, a lot of the Latvian legends and folk tales seem to revolve around the devil, who's on the extreme right-hand side, who's often portrayed as rather stupid. And this, which is for an exhibition poster, hence the Latvian painting, it says down the bottom, again shows you that he is, like so many of his era, drawn to folk tales and those famous folk songs. You can visit his museum. It's in one of the most important Art Nouveau buildings in Riga. This is where he and his wife, remember she's the Finnish opera singer with good connections, where they had a salon, lots of intellectuals came to visit. It was, you know, a melting pot of new progressive ideas. The building itself, we'll see it better later, is by Konstantin Plexens. And I'm showing you a few images of what it looks like inside. You can see a reproduction of his most famous work, you know, The Girl and the Monkey. And on the screen, there's some references there to the Japanese print, which we know everybody collected at the end of the 19th century. There's a lot of national romanticism going on in terms of the, it's more like arts and crafts, isn't it, in terms of its feel, the furniture. So the bottom one is showing you the big double height window of the studio, a little breakfast corner, which is being reconstructed. And you can see here his wife and one of the three children taking breakfast. So it's giving you a nice sort of like feel for what the studio would have looked like in Rosenthal's day, but it obviously would have been much dirtier and more cluttered, but it's a studio, a house. However, although Rosenthal's was lauded as Latvia's most important symbolist, the artist I think that many really feel represents the distinct character of Latvia is Vilhelms Pavitis. He's often described as the father of Latvian landscape, or the philosopher of snow. Remember, they're all three of my triumvirate are the same generation. They all study together at the Imperial Art Academy in St. Petersburg. So it is Rosenthal, Pavitis, and Wolfe, who is German. So it looks like Walter, but the W obviously is a V sound, Wolfe. So he'll do exactly what Rosenthal's does, having achieved success, graduated first-class honours from the Royal Academy, Imperial Art Academy. He will return to Riga in 1899. He has a glittering, I think I can say that, a really glittering institutional career. He'll actually become a professor of art and will eventually run the Latvian Academy of Art during that brief period of independence, 1919 to 1934. So this is what he specializes in: snow. He particularly likes that transition between winter and spring as the snow begins to thaw. His winter of 1910 is Latvia's most popular painting. And when they had to choose a painting to represent the whole of Latvia, it was a scheme put forward by the French. Every country in the EU, it was to celebrate, I think it was to celebrate 25 years of the EU. Every EU country had to send a painting that they thought best expressed the character of their nation, and Latvia sent Windsor. We can look at these relatively quickly because once he gets into this vein, he doesn't really change it. But his vision is shaped by the Ukrainian painter who trained him at the Imperial Academy. This is Arkhip, hang on, Kundaizihi. No, my Russian is never going to be any better than my Latvian. But this is what Arkhip specialized in. So really moody landscapes. This one is Moonlight Night from the mid-1890s. And I just love that moon hanging in the center and the wonderful reflection of it on the water. So it's in this gallery in Moscow, put together by our Burrell character, you know, collecting contemporary arts at the end of the 19th century. This is the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. Here's another one, the Red Sun on the Dnieper, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So his speciality was very distinct, either moonlight or sunset, but the light and the sort of more the mood of the landscape rather than just simply being about a sort of a photographic rendering, a realist rendering of the landscape. So Birch Trees by a River has recently been through Sotheby's. This is by Puvitis, 1905 in date. And every time I look at these, I think of Gustav Klimt. This is one of my favorite works by Klimt. Birch Forest was part of the Adele Bloch-Bauer estate, which I'm sure you've heard about. And the Forest, 1901, and the Puvitis ones are usually about the same time. I'm hoping that he might have seen a work by Gustav Klimt. I love the way the trees are cropped and you get this sort of flattening pattern, almost like a wallpaper. It's not a realistic rendering of the forest at all, but truly very evocative. You can sort of really feel the density of the trees, particularly of the one on the left-hand side. So Spring Waters is 1910. So we're back with Puvitis. And again, it's this same sort of date. You know, the patterning is important, the reflections in the water, the sort of combination of spring and the thawing snow. It's repeated. I couldn't actually get a date for this one, but I loved the luminosity of the light. But look at the zigzags in the melting snow. And you can see this is almost identical in terms of the patterning of the melting snows and the verticality of the birch trees in the background. And this one dates to 1930. So you can definitely say, without being detrimental, that he gets into a groove in terms of his landscapes. And the same can also be said for Johann Wolfe, because it's, you know, he's a German Latvian, Kurau, because he will eventually go to Germany to re-establish his career. But initially, he's part of my Latvian triumvirate. He studies alongside Rosenthal's and Puvitis at the Imperial Academy in St. Petersburg. But following the revolution of 1905, he will move to Dresden and eventually settle in Berlin. What I've definitely noticed about his paintings is the influence of James Mcneil Whistler. Whistler died in 1903, and after that there were several major retrospectives of Whistler's paintings. Not only that, but the Luxembourg had acquired, that was the Gallery of Modern Art in Paris, they had acquired Whistler's famous Mother, and that was on regular display from 1898. And this may account for Wolte's chalky texture that you see here in this painting, which is Forest Morning of 1904, but also the subdued colour. So as we go through these, and then we'll have a break for our coffee. This is Wolfe in the 1890s. So it's much more impressionistic, as you can see, broken brushwork, little ducks, and an interest in the patterning and the reflections of the water, rather like some of the landscapes that we've seen by Puvitis. This is one of his most famous works, Summer Boys Bathing of 1900. You can see again a freshness, an en plein air scenario, the boys enjoying a summer's day in the water. The cropping is definitely the influence of the Japanese prints. But the river landscape, which is in the National Gallery in Latvia, that is not a bad photograph of it. This is now, he's changed, he's gone into a sort of symbolist mode. The palette has gone chalky, it looks quite dry, and the colour is very subdued, it's sort of misty. I think he might have seen some Whistlers, which are all doing the rounds after 1903 with retrospectives. There's also an important sale of Whistler's works in London. So I'm nearly finished the painters, so I'll just bear with me for 5 minutes because we can clear the board and then concentrate on the decorative arts and architecture after our coffee break. So skipping to the next generation, this is almost like a footnote because we're taking ourselves up to the First World War. This is Alexander Romans, Landscape with Rider of 1910. So he also trains in the Imperial Academy in St. Petersburg and largely makes his living as a professional teacher. So there are very few paintings actually by him, and he settles in Jelgava. This again has become a particularly, I think, evocative work in terms of representing, I love the trees, the Latvian landscape. And even more unusual, same generation as Romans, is Aldolfus Perler, who was very much inspired by a very famous Lithuanian artist of this era by the name of Kurlionis. If you've ever been to Kaunas, you might have been to visit the art gallery there, and they have a lot of works by this particular Latvian symbolist who is out on his own completely, as he was, well, completely sort of abstract symbolism. This is simply known as the Red Sun and is Rodolfus Perler. If you think that was unusual, this one is even more so, simply entitled The Sun. You could link it back to Latvian mythology, where you have this dominance of interest in pantheism, the sun and the moon. But this is really all to do with Constantinus Kurlionis, who, suffering isn't the right word, but he had that ability to see colour and music simultaneously, which may account again for some of the unusual aspects of Rodolfus Perl's work, Perler. So here's the last one of this group, and again, please note, motif of the folk song, because you're back to this idea that Latvian national character was very invested in the folk songs and the folklore of the era. And we're going to look at Madanex, who particularly uses folkloric elements and motifs to create a very distinctive lexicon, as you can see here on the front cover of this progressive magazine, You know, we're going to go back to the folk art element.